the Scaling Up Community of Practice group on fragile states. We are delighted this morning to have, and I should say it's a very early morning for Nessa, who's on the West Coast. So a special thank you to Nessa for being up at 7 a.m. to do this. We have a great conversation ahead of us today that's going to be led by April Knox and Nessa Kenny on the topic of intergroup contact and some of the research findings that are coming out of JPAL and Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA, on this topic. And then, really pointed to the idea of what does this mean for scaling and adaptation. So really trying to merge emerging research and findings with the topics of interest to our group and to see what we can bring out of this topic. I'm going to start by introducing April and Nessa a little bit more. And we think the group is small enough that we can actually have everyone go around and just say briefly who they are and where they work. And then we'll go into the presentation that has been prepared. And then we'll have some conversation around that and then finish up. So let me start by introducing April, who is the policy manager at JPAL Global. In particular, she manages the crime, violence, and conflict sector. So she's working with governments, NGOs, academics, and others to build research partnerships and promote evidence-informed policy. Before that, April was with IPA in Monrovia, Liberia, which is part of my old stomping ground as well. After the war, I was there with peacekeeping for 2 years. So we share that. She was working on training enumerators for randomized evaluations and developing evaluation materials. She's also before that worked for R4D and in the Peace Corps as well. So it's great to have April joining us. And we also have Nessa Kenny, who is the program manager at IPA for the Peace and Recovery Program. She manages the competitive research fund there, innovation on conflict, violence, and forced displacement, and working with a variety of stakeholders on how to translate that into evidence-based policy and practice. Before that, Nessa was working with several aid agencies, implementers, UN agencies on research, program management, and fund development rules. So it's wonderful to have you both. And without further ado, let me turn it over to you to open up the presentation.
Great, that's wonderful.
Or Jonathan, did we want to go around?
Yep. That's right.
Yeah.
I just said that, and you have to be accountable. So this is, I should also start then with Rob Chase, who is my partner in crime, my co-chair of this group, and obviously my backup accountability mechanism for the things that I say and then skip over. So please, Rob, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great to have you, April, and Nessa. I'm the co-chair of this group. I currently work at the World Bank on East Africa social protection and jobs, where there's lots of fragility and lots of need for building cross group community, particularly at the moment if you're following what's happening in the Horn. Over.
I'm going to run it as I see it on the screen. So Larry.
Hi, Larry Cooley. I spent many years at Management Systems International, where I'm still affiliated, and co-founded this community practice with Johannes and co-led this working group for some years with Jonathan until Rob was kind enough to step up and take my spot.
And Johannes.
Yeah, Johannes Lin. I'm formerly World Bank, long time ago. Last 15 years working, among other things, on scaling and co-chair the scaling community practice with Larry, and delighted to be part of this.
And Jonathan.
Hi, everybody. Jonathan Marley. I'm responsible for the States of Fragility series at the OECD, and also doing work with Harsh Desai, who's on the call, on conflict prevention at scale.
And Alistair.
I'm Alistair McKechnie, Senior Research Associate at ODI London, but I operate out of my basement in the Washington suburbs. And I was at the World Bank for many years, and I've had a deep interest in fragility from that time.
And Marika.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marika Shumiris. I'm a VP at the Busara Center in Nairobi, and also the research director of the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium based at ODI in its very final week. It's closing its doors next Wednesday, so I needed a new endeavor, which is co-directing with Jonathan Papoulides the Atelier for Transformative Collaboration in Fragile Settings. Very nice to be here.
And Jackie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Kiernan. I am a project director at the Education Development Center. I am working in post-conflict or volatile, fragile contexts. I spent 14 years in Eastern DRC working for a variety of humanitarian organizations as well as UNICEF, and also have experience in Niger.
And Harsh.
Yeah, hi everybody. Harsh Desai here as part of the States of Fragility team at the OECD. Great to join this again and see everybody, and looking forward to hearing from colleagues on their research. Thanks.
Wonderful. And without further ado, over to April and Nessa.
Great, well, thank you all. And while April is putting up their presentation, I just wanted to remark on sort of the range of expertise and backgrounds in the room. I think it'll make for a really fruitful discussion. So thank you for having us today. As Jonathan said, I'm Nessa Kenny. I work at Innovations for Poverty Action's Peace and Recovery Program. And I'm joined by my colleague, April, who I work very closely with. She manages the crime, violence, and conflict sector at JPAL. And it's our pleasure to be with you today to present emerging evidence on intergroup contact in fragile contexts, and hopefully to think collaboratively with you about the potential for scaling and the application of these results across contexts. Given it's such a small group, please feel free sort of to stop us through if there are any questions that arise. And of course, we'll also leave plenty of time at the end for discussion. Do you want to move to the next slide, April? Great. So what are we going to talk about today? Very briefly, we'll introduce who we are and what we do. We'll talk through some recent exciting research on intergroup contact. We'll then think about how that evidence might sort of generalize to other contexts and scale using a framework called the generalizability framework that April will discuss. And then finally, we'll think through sort of these potential for future horizons for intergroup contact programming. And we really look forward to the discussion afterwards. So on the next slide, there's a very brief overview of who IPA and JPAL are for those that may not be as familiar. We both share the mission of reducing poverty by ensuring that programming and policy is informed by scientific evidence. We primarily do this through conducting randomized trials of social programs. We work globally, so JPAL has a network of 200 affiliated professors at 50 universities, and IPA tends to work with that group and many more in the implementation of randomized evaluations. And we have more than 30 offices worldwide. So IPA, for instance, has permanent country presence in around 25 lower and middle income countries. Thus far together, we have conducted over 1,000 randomized evaluations in 80 countries and sort of have several hundred ongoing at the moment. And on the next slide, you'll see that recently both of our organizations have made a concerted push to build the evidence base in fragile states through our joint Governance, Crime and Conflict Initiative, or GCCI, which is generously supported by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And it's comprised of 3 linked research initiatives that are listed here, 2 of which April and I work for. And since 2017, GCCI has supported a range of rigorous policy relevant research to hopefully inform better policy and programming on crime and violence and corruption and instability, or programming that improves governance or supports recovery or resilience in countries affected by crisis and disaster. And I think importantly, the research that we support also aims to answer these fundamental questions that we have about these topics, hopefully providing generalizable insights that are useful, not just in the context where the research was carried out, but also in other contexts. And so on the next slide, you'll see that to date, we've supported over 90 evaluations or studies. Generally, most are randomized evaluations. There are some quasi-experiments and some panel studies in almost 40 countries that are depicted here. Excitingly for us, this includes some of the first randomized evaluations in fragile settings where research traditionally has been very challenging for understandable reasons, including places like South Sudan and Somalia. And our goal in supporting these studies on the next slide is that these results are used to inform policy and practice. And this is roughly how we think of doing so. But talking to groups like this I think is an important part of this process for a few reasons. One, it allows us to spend time sort of thinking about how the research that we support speaks to other research and also speaks to practice in the space. It provides an opportunity for us to tell people what we've learned. And then finally, it also provides really useful inputs for us when thinking about what the next phase of evidence generation might be. So what are the questions you have or would like answered? Those are important inputs for us in thinking about the next phase of evidence that we might support. So with that said, we'll very briefly give an overview of recent research on intergroup contact. And on the next slide, you'll see a question that is the driving question of a lot of the research that we do. And broadly, I think this question won't seem unfamiliar to those of you in this room. Rebuilding social ties in the aftermath of conflict is a really common goal for programming in fragile states and peace building programming in particular. And the logic here, I suppose, is that promoting social ties and rebuilding social cohesion between groups and communities can prevent future conflict in a couple of ways. It can influence norms that govern social relationships, so encourage more sort of pro-social norms or norms around peaceful dispute management. It can increase the exchange of information. So as we know, sort of asymmetries in information or incorrect beliefs about other groups are often seen to be sort of one of the drivers of conflict. And then this change in norms and this increase in exchange of information hopefully can encourage peaceful bargaining, which can help diffuse intergroup tensions. And there's lots of different types of programs that have where this is roughly built into that theory of change, and it has these sort of social cohesion goals, including programming like as big as community-driven development to sort of formal reconciliation programming post-conflict to alternative dispute resolution training. And one approach on the next slide that you'll see is intergroup contact interventions. And these interventions bring together individuals from different sides of social cleavages to hopefully reduce prejudice and discriminatory behavior against the outgroup, thereby sort of hopefully diffusing these intergroup tensions that might contribute to conflict and building peace. So this intergroup contact, so contact between two different groups can be facilitated in a variety of ways and through a variety of interventions. So it could be sports leagues or training programs or public work programs or trades associations or service clubs, but whatever the actual intervention, it's argued that intergroup contact needs to meet a certain set of conditions in order to be effective. So those are a common goal. So both groups need to be working together towards a common goal. They need to have equal status vis-a-vis one another. They need to have some sort of support from broad authorities. And then finally, there needs to be a lack of intergroup competition or some kind of cooperative task. And on the next slide, you'll see that there's quite a broad literature that does exist thinking about intergroup contact. So there are a couple of meta-analyses listed at the bottom that have looked at over 500 studies that do look at this phenomena or these types of programs. But there are drawbacks to a lot of the research that has been done thus far. Only 27, I believe, of the studies that are included or that have been surveyed involve random assignment, and without sort of some method of comparison, it may be harder to assess the causal effect of intergroup contact. These studies have been conducted with in a limited set of contexts with very few populations. So very few are in conflict affected settings where perhaps we might have the most to gain from this type of research or this type of intervention. Most are conducted in high income countries. Very few looked at contact between members of different ethnic or religious groups. So most were looking at gender or sexual orientation or disability, for instance. And the studies that do actually look at ethnic differences find substantially weaker effects of interventions that bring together people across ethnic divides. And there are also very few studies of adults over the age of 25. And I think as well, there's a fear with some of the research that's been done that the change that we may see in terms of thinking that contact is effective may not translate into sort of sustained real world behavior. So often outcomes are measured only very shortly after the program ends. So within 24 hours, most involve the self-reporting of attitudes or behaviors. And there are sort of very few real world behavior measures that are captured in these studies. And so that one of the recent literature reviews concludes that the jury is really really still out about whether or not intergroup contact is an effective policy and programming tool. This was before, on the next slide, you'll see a few studies that came out in the last few years that are looking at the impacts of intergroup contact across divides with mixed results. I won't go into the results of these studies individually, but there was work in India, Nigeria, Israel, and Afghanistan. And I'll just say that some of these studies face similar challenges to measuring real world behavior, measuring sort of either self-reported behavior or behavior using behavioral games and surveys. But there was one study that came out really recently on the next slide, which we wanted to talk about today. And this overcame sort of many of the challenges that previous studies had and measured real world behavior in really exciting and creative ways. So the context of this evaluation and intervention is Erbil and Karakush in Iraq, where there's a significant population of Iraqi Christians displaced by ISIS in a predominantly Muslim area. And the area is characterized by a deep mistrust between the two communities. So there's a perception among the Christians that the Muslim population sympathized with ISIS or were somehow complicit in the raids that led to their displacement. And so in a region where soccer is hugely popular, the researcher partnered with a local Christian community organization, the local provincial council, and Christian faith leaders to create a soccer league that brought Christian and Muslim players together to look at the impacts of intergroup contact on attitudes and behaviors towards the outgroup. And this intervention satisfies all of the conditions that we talked about on a few slides ago of intergroup contact. So it had the support of local authorities, local Christian leaders and organizations endorsed the leagues. People were cooperating towards shared goals, and all of the players had an equal status vis-a-vis one another. So what did the study design look like in practice? A random set of teams were invited to be part of the league. And they were told that in order to be part of the league, they needed to add 3 additional members, and that those members either were going to be Christian or they were going to be Muslim, and whether they were going to be Christian or Muslim would be random. The league had incentives to participate, so they had jerseys and professional referees and awards, and it made it appealing to teams to sort of take that chance about who the members that would be added would be. And as with randomized evaluations, you're benchmarking the impact of an intervention on specific outcomes against a comparison group. So here, what happened was there were 42 Christian soccer teams divided into 21 teams that had 3 Muslims added, so where we could hopefully see the impacts of intergroup contact. And then there were 21 teams of that 42 that were all Christian. So the 3 players that were added were Christian, and that served as a comparison to look at what the impacts were. And then there was one league that served just as a comparison league, so there was no exposure to Muslim players at all. On the next slide, one of the things that's really exciting about this study is the measurement. So complex social phenomena are notoriously really hard to measure. And this researcher had some really innovative ways of measuring real world behavior that we think might speak to increased tolerance or trust. She measured what she called on the field outcomes. So these capture behavior towards Muslims within the intervention. So things like whether or not Christian players continued to train with Muslims 6 months later, whether or not they voted for Muslims in a sportsmanship prize. She also measured off the field outcomes. So these capture behaviors towards Muslims who are outside of the intervention. So people were invited to attend a neighborhood social event, and the researcher measured whether or not they attended. Or alternatively, people were given vouchers to encourage them to patronize a business in a Muslim-owned neighborhood, and the researcher measured whether or not people redeemed those vouchers at restaurants. There was also a survey compensation donation. So this is a really common measure in randomized evaluations where people, in order to thank them for their time, are given a small amount of money, and sometimes they're given the option to donate their survey compensation or a portion of their survey compensation to groups that reveal their preferences. So in this case, there was an option at the end of the survey to give their survey compensation to a Christian organization, so a church, or a neutral NGO that benefited both Christians and Muslims. And then finally, the researcher did a survey with local residents to measure spillovers. So the impact on those that didn't participate directly in the intervention. I see there's a question. Let me just look at the chat quickly. Were the teams provided with opportunity, tools, guidance on intergroup communication or peace building? No, they weren't, which is interesting. And so the researcher really just wanted to look at what the impacts of pure contact through this type of intervention was. Though she is designing a follow-up that combines this sort of soccer intervention with empathy education. So with the idea that you want to add sort of some kind of explicit communication intervention or peace building intervention alongside contact, and seeing if that sort of augments the results. And maybe we can talk a bit more about that after. Great. So what was found on the next slide? We'll see briefly what the results of the study are. I think excitingly, on the field behavior changed. So players who participated in mixed teams were 13 percentage points more likely to say that they would register for a mixed team the next season. They were 26 percentage points more likely to vote for a Muslim player who wasn't on their team to receive a sportsmanship prize. And they were 49% more likely to train with Muslims in the community 6 months after the intervention ended. So very excitingly, we did see real changes in real world behavior because of the intervention. Unfortunately, off the field behavior didn't change in any detectable way, suggesting that on the field tolerance didn't generalize towards Muslim strangers. So people were no more likely to go to the mixed social event that we talked about or patronize the Muslim-owned restaurant in Mosul that they received the vouchers to. And then we also saw that personal beliefs and attitudes proved a bit harder to modify. So trust towards the outgroup didn't change. So people, for instance, didn't report increased comfort in mixed neighborhoods. And so taken together, I think we can say that although contact in this case built tolerant behaviors towards peers within an intervention, building broader social cohesion outside of that context may be more challenging. And a possible explanation here is that trusting strangers can be especially difficult for people who have experienced conflict and in places where tensions are still very high. So what does this mean for programming? On the next slide, we'll see some policy insights. I think one main takeaway of this research is that even if contact effects don't generalize to the entire outgroup, strengthening ties at a local level between peers may still build resilience and contribute to localized social cohesion that may contribute to peace. We may wonder whether or not this localized cohesion is enough, or whether there needs to be sort of broader transformational change in how outgroups are viewed. And we don't yet know, I guess, whether this localized social cohesion can shield these communities from future shocks to tolerance, for instance, or such as a resurgence in intergroup violence. A couple of other takeaways from the work, I think measuring real world behavior is really important. As we saw, attitudes didn't really change, but behaviors in the intervention did. And so thinking about how we can really measure, I think what we care about the most, changes in behavior of participants, is an important thing that this particular study did that I hope more to do in the future so that we can really see the effects. And then finally, I think, and then April will speak more about this, but this type of theory can really apply to lots of different types of interventions that bring people together. And I think that will be an important piece of framing for the scaling conversation. And with that, I'll pass it on to April.
Great, thanks, Nessa. Maybe just before I start going into the generalizability framework, I'll pause just to see if there's any sort of pressing questions, especially on specifically the study by Salma Musa. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in. Okay.
I have just a quick factual question. In terms of the contact that was occasioned by being on the same sports team, I imagine there were practices, there were games. Is there anything else that the teams did together beyond what they did on the field that was just part of the normal team formation, team operation function? I'm trying to get a sense as to what the dosage would feel like if you were inside the experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll admit that I'm not entirely sure, but my sense is that the the vast majority of the contact, if not all of the contact, was on the field. So it was people training together in practices and playing together in games, and that there wasn't at least a norm in the community of those two communities spending a lot of mixed social time otherwise together. So my sense is that it was at the very least primarily the majority of the contact was on the field.
So you got to experience the person as a player and to some extent as a human being, but not in a very broad range of other interactions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Looks like Johannes.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So let's assume your results had been more positive. In other words, you really thought, oh boy, this really works not only on the field, it works really off the field. How would you, in retrospect, how would one design an impact evaluation like this to also give you a sense of whether or not what you experienced here is replicable, scalable? You know, so what are the conditions that actually, you know, you would need to think about and meet in order to replicate this in maybe different contexts, maybe in similar contexts? What were the specific contextual conditions that made this actually possible? And what would you need to replicate? So to me, from a scaling perspective, that is always the key question, where I feel RCTs, yeah, tell us about impact of that intervention, but unless they're complemented with other evaluation questions and approaches, they don't tell us very much, if anything, about replicability and scalability. Thank you.
Great. Johannes, you just did a great job previewing what we're going to get into with some of the generalizability framework. So we'll get into all those questions, but maybe just before we do that, any final questions related specifically to the study from Iraq? If not, we can move on. I don't think I see any other hands raised. So, but again, feel free to sort of chime in throughout as we're going and raise your hand or put something in the chat and we'll be happy to respond. Great. Okay, so now that we've heard from Nessa some of the emerging evidence on intergroup context theory, there's this obvious question of how do we actually apply what we're learning? So how do we take lessons from Iraq, Nigeria, India, and elsewhere and think about applying them into new contexts, especially contexts that are facing fragility or conflict? And also, how do we think about moving these types of interventions to greater scale? So at JPL and at IPA, we use what we call the generalizability framework as a way of helping us think through these questions of thinking about how do we apply evidence from one context to another. And it really revolves around four main questions. So the first is, what is the theory of change behind the original program? So in other words, what problem was the program trying to address, and why would we expect it to be effective in leading to these intended outcomes? Then, if you were to implement that intervention in your context, do the same local conditions hold? So getting to Johannes's point, in that new context for that same theory to apply. So in other words, what similarities are there across contexts that we can observe that may help us assess whether or not this type of intervention is well suited for this new environment, but also what are the key differences and how can we take those into account? Then we think about how strong is the evidence for the required general behavioral change that we're looking for. So here we can draw on literature from economics, but also from other fields like political science, psychology, sociology, even common sense, to gauge the likelihood that this approach may be effective. And in some cases, we might end up kind of determining that we don't actually have enough evidence and we think additional evaluation is needed. And then finally, what is the evidence that the implementation can be carried out well? So going back to local conditions, are the basic logistical, administrative, political processes in place that can actually allow us to implement the same type of program with fidelity? So the program doesn't necessarily have to look exactly the same. A program that maybe was carried out by an NGO in one context may be better delivered by the government in another. But we need to know that there's at least some entity that has the capacity and ability to actually push this work forward. So I'm going to walk through the framework step by step and use Salma's study on intergroup contact in Iraq as sort of an illustrative example of how we can think through using this framework to potentially bring this type of intervention to new contexts. So starting with theory of change, this is step one in our framework. We start by thinking about what was the theory of change behind the original program. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this concept, or might call it by another name, like a log frame or something similar. But for the purpose of this conversation, we'll just generally define a theory of change as a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why an intervention leads to an impact. And I won't go through this flowchart in depth, but we'll walk through this theory of change with Iraq as an example. So if we take the example of Salman Musa's study from Iraq, we can put together our own rough theory of change behind why the interreligious soccer league may have led to the outcomes of interest we were interested in. And I'll note that this doesn't specifically come from the researcher or the paper, but it's meant to be more of a stylized example that we've put together for the sake of this presentation. So starting with needs, we know that in Iraq, following the ISIS invasions, as Christians who had been displaced were beginning to return home, there was this major need for both healing and rebuilding of trust between religious groups, especially recognizing that many Christians, as Nessa mentioned, often viewed their Muslim neighbors as complicit in ISIS attacks due to shared religion. And we also know that these existing religious divides, though certainly exacerbated by the ISIS attacks in the region, have existed for many, many years. So some of these social norms and breakdowns in trust and attitude are deeply ingrained and thus likely difficult to budge. So recognizing these needs, the researcher and local collaborators chose to implement an intergroup contact intervention to try to address existing prejudice and bias and help build trust and cohesion between these historically divided groups. And as Nessa mentioned, this intervention included a lot of the specific elements that we would think of in traditional contact theory. So things like cooperative contact, having people of mixed religions working together on one team, uniting teams around a common goal or interest. So in this case, soccer being the common interest, and obviously trying to win games also being a goal that they were working towards together. And finally, endorsement by local authorities, in this case, Christian religious authorities, that really helped create an enabling environment for this league to move forward. In reality, this resulted in a 10-week soccer league. As Nessa mentioned, there was a number of incentives provided to help people participate in the league, like uniforms, trophies, and referees. And beyond participants playing in the league, community members were also welcome and really encouraged to attend matches. And so the idea here was that beyond just those who are participating in the soccer matches, this could potentially spill over into the broader community. Then if we think about the behavior change that we're really looking to see, the league was intended to improve attitudes towards members of the outgroup, strengthen social ties and norms as evidenced by increased engagements and friendships between members of different religions, also meant to increase trust and then increase community participation and interaction. And the overall intended impact of the program was to improve social cohesion broadly, but we could also think of it as potentially being a pathway to reducing incidents of conflict and ideally preventing backslide into conflict. So this wasn't so much an explicit objective of this particular study, but increasingly as we're seeing intergroup contact interventions being applied in fragile and conflict affected states, this does seem to be an outcome of interest that many researchers and implementers are kind of looking to see whether or not these programs can achieve. So once we figured out the theory of change for the original study, it's now time to think about how could this apply to different contexts. So the second step in our framework is to find descriptive data that will help us better understand if the underlying issues from that original context are also at play in the community in which we're trying to kind of replicate this intervention. So basically what we're trying to do here is to understand whether or not there's really the same underlying need, as well as whether or not that need is kind of triggered by the same underlying causes. So here we might find, or we might use data from surveys, focus groups, interviews, past research, or other public sources that speaks to the prevalence of the need or problem in this new population. And often at the stage, a needs assessment or other kind of introductory research is needed to really suss out what's happening in this new environment. So if we turn back to Iraq, if we dive deeper into the local conditions that were in place at the start of the intervention, as we already saw in the theory of change, we generally see the issues as follows. There was deeply divided society, distrust and negative attitudes between social groups, this risk of backslide into conflict, and also a need for healing. If we take a step back and think about what has led to these particular needs in society, it's certainly very complex and multifaceted, but two key causes seem to be these decades of religious persecution against Christians, as well as obviously the recent ISIS attacks and violence against Christians and others in the community. And then finally, if we look at the conditions that were in place at the start of the intervention, we see that many Christians were beginning to return home after they had been forcibly displaced, and they were returning to massive destruction and coping with numerous losses from the conflict. The leagues were also implemented in areas that were majority Christian. So this is an important consideration for this type of programming, in that there was a clear kind of in versus out group dynamic in place that did not necessarily put players on equal footing at the start of the league. But that said, soccer was seen as this uniting factor between groups. It's a sport that's nationally loved and that members of both religious groups commonly participate in. And then finally, as we've said multiple times now, the leagues were endorsed by local authorities, so signaling a broader community acceptance of the program that created beneficial enabling conditions for the league to move forward. Then the third step in our framework is to assess the strength of evidence for the mechanisms that made the program effective in the original context, and whether the key assumptions are likely to hold in our new context. So here you'd answer questions like, what evidence exists that the theory of change from the original program is valid? And also what is the quality of this evidence? Also, what are the underlying assumptions or underlying reasons for why this theory is generally effective? So what are the mechanisms that might be driving change? And also, what assumptions are required and do they hold in these settings? So in this step, what we're doing is we're really diving into thinking about people and not necessarily place. And it helps to take a step back and think about what literature, whether again from economics, psychology, or elsewhere, related to human behavior might be related to this intervention, and use this to inform our analysis. So if the evidence is strong that this addresses something fundamental to human behavior generally, then this makes a stronger case beyond just the one study that it's likely this type of intervention may generalize to other contexts. And it's also helpful at this point in helping us move beyond needing to replicate the exact design of the program. So in Iraq, while soccer was the delivery vehicle, is there evidence that supports the core elements of the intervention? So things like cooperation, common goal, things of that nature, as really driving the impacts we're most interested in? And are there other ways we could think about creating these same conditions through other types of interventions, like jobs training or classroom-based interventions or elsewise? So going back to the evidence presented earlier, now we can see that there's a fairly robust literature on contact theory. So I won't go into this in depth as Nessa already previewed a lot of this, but we've seen multiple meta-analyses on contact theory. Earlier analyses kind of coming to the conclusion that contact works in reducing prejudice, but more recent meta-analyses kind of highlighting some open questions, particularly around how contact might differentially impact people based on racial or ethnic bias. And also seeing kind of a lack of evidence from fragile and conflict affected settings, including on thinking about how contact might help individuals interact with one another in these types of contexts that are experiencing or recovering from conflict. But obviously, we also see that these gaps are starting to be filled with recent studies from Afghanistan, Iraq, India, and Nigeria. And we can also think about the broader literature on social cohesion that we can draw from. So this includes studies on reconciliation, community-driven development, perspective taking, and other similar types of interventions. So for instance, there's been studies on truth and reconciliation in Sierra Leone and perspective taking in classrooms in Turkey that also shed light on the potential effectiveness of bringing groups together to promote social bonds. And then we need to think through what are the underlying reasons for why this theory is generally effective. And so when we look at the contact literature, this is actually an area that researchers are still trying to unpack. But what we can see from the literature on this topic is that the delivery mechanism itself, whether it be soccer, cricket, or vocational training, doesn't seem to be the critical element. Rather, it seems to be something more about the prolonged positive collaboration around mutual interests and common goals that's really driving the impacts of interest. And obviously, there's also some assumptions that are required to assume that this general approach will work elsewhere. The key assumption that we see as sort of allowing this theory to hold, though we can certainly debate whether this is true, is that the majority of individuals at their core, they want to live in societies that are peaceful, where there's mutual respect and trust between neighbors. And to achieve these ends, these individuals have to have an openness, even if not necessarily outwardly expressed, to engage in and to engage with others and improve relationships with members of the outgroup. So essentially just people are open to having their minds changed. And so then finally, the last step in our framework is to assess whether you, if you're the implementer, or another organization can actually successfully implement the intervention with fidelity to the original model. So this requires answering questions about just basic implementation assumptions about being able to actually implement the program, and what types of factors might be enabling or hindering this type of program from going from one context to another. So finally, if we look back at our example, the following conditions seem to enable the intervention to take place. First of all, safety. It was safe enough for groups to convene and for members of the outgroup to be accepted into soccer leagues without negative backlash. Also, access is something to consider. This was actually somewhat of a challenge in this setting, particularly for Muslim players to be able to actually get to soccer matches. In some cases, their Christian teammates actually pitched in to help them get rides. So this is something to take into consideration when thinking through the design of your program. How closely are people settled? And does this intervention require significant travel? And then, as we talked about many, many times, communication. So here, having local support and endorsement to the league was critical. And in this example, the soccer league was run by a Christian NGO, but it's also possible that elsewhere similar programs could be implemented by other entities, including the state. Though it's important to think through what implications this may have. For instance, you may want to make sure this type of programming isn't overly politicized in order to really create open environments for collaboration. So I realize I went through all that very, very quickly, but in general, that is how we sort of think about applying the generalizability framework through those steps. Again, this is kind of meant to be more of an illustrative example, given kind of the proliferation of context theory-based interventions that we're seeing kind of increasingly applied in the peace building and fragility, conflict, and violence affected states. So maybe I'll pause there just to see if there's any specific questions on the framework. And I also realize we're quickly approaching time. So happy to kind of open up the conversation. And then our final slides are just to highlight some ongoing research as well as some open questions that we see on context theory. So I can go through those very quickly at the end.
Thanks, April and Nessa. This is fabulous and very stimulating, very interesting. You know, the point about prolonged engagement over time, creating more behavioral cooperation is really interesting. You make a distinction between the attitudes not necessarily being generalizably better, but behaviors being, you know, pro cooperation within the intervention. I wonder, what is the name of that? What is the behavioral mechanism there, where the attitude stays more or less the same, or in general terms, but the behavior changes? Is that something that was lifted out in the research at all? The other question I had was around the idea of how to equalize, right? One of the key first slides was around assuming that there's an equal status between groups. And of course, that's rather hard to do, especially in places with outsized political economies and clientelist networks and past conflict. And it was interesting to me that in the place where they could donate, the players could donate to an NGO or to a church, a mosque wasn't also included in there, which would have seemed to me be more of an equalizing piece, right? And it could have yielded some interesting findings in terms of whether the Christians were interested in contributing to a mosque. So I'm just wondering what was the thinking behind that, if you know it. And the final piece for me was around, you mentioned that there were authorities that endorsed the soccer team, the mixed soccer team. What were they? Were they government authorities? Or were they also sort of church and mosque authorities? Was that another attempt at equalizing there?
Great. I can go ahead and get started, but maybe I'll start with the first question on attitudes versus behavior, and maybe Nessa, if you want to go into kind of some of the more specifics on the Iraq study. So in terms of attitudes versus behaviors, I think that something that has come up a lot in conversations with different researchers looking at intergroup contact is, first of all, the attitudes are just really hard to measure. It's hard to come up with different indicators that are going to really get at those changes effectively, because often they're self-reported, whereas behaviors, it's a little bit easier to develop kind of objective measures to observe how people are actually changing the ways that they're interacting with one another. So it's just kind of inherently a measurement challenge. But the other thing that I know Salma in particular has mentioned is that it's also possible that attitudes just take much longer to change, especially where some of these kind of social norms are really deeply ingrained, where there is this distrust between groups. And so it might be that just these shorter term studies aren't quite getting there in terms of actually shifting attitudes, or really seeing that prolonged change in how attitudes might be changing. And a final point on that is also thinking about, this was a question from earlier, but this intervention didn't explicitly have dialogue around peace building or about building trust or really addressing some of those kind of underlying factors at play. And possibly if there had been those components as part of this intervention, maybe that would have helped shift attitudes more. So those are just kind of some hypotheses around it.
Yeah, and maybe one other thing to add from the research is that this seems to be a phenomenon that we're seeing across contexts, is that behaviors may shift quite a bit faster than attitudes. So for instance, Betsy Levy-Pollock has a study in Rwanda where she sort of sees the same thing with this radio intervention, this like peace building radio intervention, where the attitudes of individuals towards the outgroup don't really budge, but their willingness to sort of step up and dissent and like express dissenting opinions when they believe that something wrong is happening increases significantly. And so I think we've seen this sort of attitudinal lag across a lot of studies, and it's interesting because Jonathan, your question about naming it, I don't know if we've gotten there yet, but I'm very curious to sort of see where the characterization or literature goes from here. The point about mosques and endorsement is very well taken. I think the purpose of, or the question in this study, due to the way it was designed, was most of the outcomes are looking at the beliefs of the Christian players. And so in that case, it was really important to have this endorsement from Christian authorities. There wasn't sort of the statistical power to look at the change in beliefs of the Muslim players, the change in behaviors of the Muslim players. But certainly I think in a scaled up version of this experiment, and in order to have an impact on both groups, I think you would want sort of, as you suggest, sort of this complementary endorsement from Muslim organizations or mosques as well. There may have been a question that we missed though.
That's perfect. There are a few in the chat box. We can ask the questioner to send them if that's easier, or if you've read them and can answer them now and let me know.
Great. I see Jackie has her hand raised and also has a question in there, so maybe I'll let her go ahead and speak.
Hi again. So I'm just kind of, and this might go beyond the scope of what we want to discuss today, but I am really interested in how we would measure attitude change without using the self-reporting. Because I worked for a peace building organization in the DRC, and we could demonstrate in our surveys that there was attitude change, but it was self-reporting in an area where there was sort of expectations among the population to report positively, to continue to foster investments in the local community, and then maybe behaviors that didn't reflect the attitudinal changes. So is there a way of measuring that? Are there tools available?
Nessa, do you want to go ahead? I'm happy to take a stab.
Sure, yeah, happy to as well. Go ahead and I can add anything.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think that the kind of cop-out answer is there's still a lot of work to be done on improving attitudinal measures, but I think this is where different kind of behavioral games and proxy measures can kind of come into play. So some of the, like Vanessa was describing with thinking about how do you choose terms of who you're going to donate to, a Christian NGO versus kind of a non-religious NGO. I think there's different ways that you can kind of suss out how that maybe is tied to attitudinal changes, depending on how you design and measure those, but certainly not perfect. But Nessa, go ahead with anything else.
Yeah, and I think from sort of a technical perspective, we're getting a lot better at asking these types of questions, and asking sort of sensitive questions about attitudes towards an outgroup in a conflict-affected context is a really sensitive and hard thing to do. And so I do think that there are lots of ways of designing questions that researchers have come up with in the last, really quite recently, that encourage more honest responses, I suppose, and super happy to sort of share some resources there if that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks. And just thinking out loud here, wondering if maybe actually the behavior is not the priority in this context rather than the attitude, because if we're looking at skill sets, what we can actually work on, and then continued kind of contact between two groups in conflict, I guess that might be more important. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's an interesting chicken and egg problem in some ways, because I can also see how one would think that attitudes would sort of drive choices for future contact or for future sort of positive interaction. So absolutely.
So we're getting close to the hour. Let's do 2 more questions from the chat box. One is from Alistair, asking if there's a Sunni Shia dimension here, and if so, would working on the Sunni Shia attitudes also be relevant? I know this is more of a Christian orientation, but did that come up at all? And then Johannes's question about whether a mixed method approach was used here, qualitative and quantitative, and if not, would the quantitative dimension help in any way through RCTs, etc.?
I'm happy, maybe going backwards. So for the quantitative versus qualitative mixed methods, I will say that most of the randomized evaluations that researchers are doing in our network combine some sort of quantitative and qualitative element. Certainly the generalizability framework has a lot of qualitative components, recognizing the need for needs assessments and really to understand the context in which a program is going to be kind of taken from one context to another. So there's definitely a very large element of that there. And I think especially when working in fragile and conflict affected settings with populations that have experienced conflict, having this qualitative evidence to kind of bolster the quantitative evidence that's being collected is incredibly important. So definitely something we encourage across research projects is to have kind of a cross methods approach.
Great, and yeah, the question about the Sunni Shia dimension, this study didn't particularly look at that, but we sort of have seen designs for studies that look at intergroup contact across those divides as well, and so I certainly think it could be a ripe divide to look at the impact of contact.
Great, April and Nessa, really, I am fascinating work. There are dozens of questions I've got all sorts of stickies that I put all over my desk that I'd love to use and talk to. I'd like to give you both the floor, as it were. I know you didn't get to your last 2 slides, April, but I would like to hear just a couple of minutes, aware that we're trying to respect people's time to close in 3 minutes. A couple of thoughts on future directions, and then I'll try to wrap up. Over to you, April. Or April or Nessa. Just to cover that last slide you didn't get.
Yeah, for the sake of time, I won't throw them up there again, but happy to share the slides more broadly. So I think in terms of future horizons for research, I think some of the interesting open questions from my perspective are, first of all, thinking about whether or not all of these kind of core components of the contact theory have to necessarily be in place for contact to be effective. So are there ways of having kind of lighter touch forms of contact that might be more or less effective and trying to kind of really suss out what are the key drivers behind attitudinal and behavioral change. And then another area that I think, especially the co-chairs, academic chairs that we work with at IPA and JPL, Chris Button and Drilla Dubé, they have been trying to push a lot and thinking about what are the kind of deeper types of contact. Sorry, that might not be the clearest phrase, but thinking about beyond just kind of you know, a lot of these contact interventions are a little bit unnatural in how they come about. It's like, let's put together a soccer league, and it's not something that's always necessarily happening in the community. So how do you think about kind of more real world forms of contact and deeper linkages between people, whether that be trade unions or other types of economic contact, and thinking about how that might shift behaviors and attitudes as well? So I think those are really interesting areas for future research.
And I think in some ways that can speak to scaling. So I think that there are lots of different types of interventions that this can be built into. So for instance, one of the ongoing evaluations that I think is really interesting is looking at bringing together Jordanian hosts and Syrian refugees on work teams for this like multi-billion-dollar World Bank infrastructure project in Jordan. And what they're doing is simply mixing the teams that are working to build that infrastructure. And so I do think that there's a lot of possibility to think about how to, at scale, build in this type of contact into interventions that would otherwise happen, that it just means bringing people together to sort of cooperate to that common goal within sort of like a variety of interventions, as opposed to something, as April said, like soccer.
No, thank you very much. And Jonathan, I see that you put up a request for more literature and more research and frankly more conversation. And so let me just use this closing role of the chair to first of all, thank you. Really amazing, interesting work that JPEL and IPA are doing in this realm. I think utterly relevant to what our group on scaling up and fragility are thinking about, and really grateful to you for starting for launching a conversation. It's part of a conversation we have ongoing. We invite you to join that conversation in lots of different ways. A couple of quick reflections just for the road and perhaps to continue that conversation. I think that the work on contact and the depth of contact is really just so important when thinking about fragility. I love what you said, April, about whether or not this is an unnatural contact that has been created. The ex-econometrician in me says Hawthorne effects, right? To what degree are people just feeling like, wow, you put me in this weird situation and I'm going to act differently as a result? And so that sort of sense of generalizable contact that doesn't feel unnatural is an area I think that's really interesting. In a previous life, I've told April and Nessa this. I did some work on intergroup contact and social capital in the Philippines. The major finding of which is the best way to do that is to build a road between villages, and that road creates sort of it doesn't feel forced. It just means that people have opportunities to contact with the other in ways that they. Sorry, my dog in the back doesn't like my comments. I think some of the things that you put on the table about the difference between attitudes and behaviors, my personal bias is that behaviors always trump attitudes when trying to do the research, but at the base of it, it's the attitudes and the narratives that are inside people that are going to allow people to make progress on working towards peace. But I think that one of the outstanding questions we need to think about with great humility is the need to be very multidisciplinary in thinking about all this work, because in some ways, when I use the language of the other, going back to our conversation at the outset, Larry, my conversation yesterday with my French tutor was all about Jacques Lacan and the ideas about, embracing or being aware that we in some ways need to have an other, but that also is something that we dread. And that I think is at the base of a lot of what we're trying to do on working with fragility and peace. With that sort of philosophic way to end Good Friday from my perspective, and my dog going crazy again on my comments, if you can hear it in the background, really wonderful to have you join our conversation, and hope to have you back either as participant, as a presenter or a participant, and thanks to all for joining the conversation. Thanks.
Yes,
Cheers.
thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank you. Great
Guys.
session.
Bye-bye.